with Scrooge. And I never
But
saw
for Honeycock Dickens, Fagin's a lot worse.
well and that's what they said, but they said that Fagin at least has there's some well, first of all, he has not redeeming qualities, but he's not necessarily I get well. First of all, Dickens actually took the charges of anti-Semitism somewhat to heart, and in some I guess the later editions that he approved, they took out the word Fagin the Jew. So he actually took some of that to heart, that he was perpetrating it. But he said, look, he was trying to capture what life was like in that time, and there were
Jewish gangsters.
Jewish gangsters in the East End. But again, it goes back, I think, to some extent. I was thinking about it today about Shylock and the Merchant of Venice, and the way Jews have been portrayed in the media, and especially in literature, and especially English literature, because that's the one, that's the literature that we're most familiar with. Right. And in all of the cases of Harry Potter, of Dickens, of Shakespeare, I think there might be, it might be one of those things where, maybe there's some tropes that people just, they don't even think about, that they employ, because they're not saying it's good or bad. It's just like, it's part of, like, they're not aware of the perpetuation of anti-Semitism or these kind of stereotypes, but it's just so much a part of the culture. And again, I would compare it to some extent to the way African Americans were portrayed for years in the media, that they were hoodlums, or that they were basketball players, or there was like only certain things that Black Americans would do in the media as well. And it sometimes it was offensive, and sometimes it was, Robert Townsend did a great movie years ago called Hollywood Shuffle, about being an actor and going out for parts where those are the only things that they wanted African American actors to do. And I thought about it, that sometimes it's just, I don't say it's lazy, but it's like people just, to have a Shylock character was just like, you just did it. I don't think Shakespeare was necessarily anti-Semitic. I think he was just used what were the stereotypes that he had at the time, and people argue over whether there's a human, he portrays him more human than he actually went out of his way to portray more. I don't know that that's really the issue, other than he just used the material that he had. He used it, and we can discuss it now and kind of think about the significance of it and be upset about it or get emotional about it. But at the time, I don't know that people were really cognizant of it or did it intentionally. So.
Well, that kind of goes for the readers then too. I mean, I don't know that anybody who's reading Harry Potter and runs across the goblins is going to have their negative feelings about Jews reinforced and think, oh, those Jews are just like the goblins in Harry Potter.
Right.
It's more negative about bankers generally, I'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I just reread an Jane Austen book, and in it, like 4 times, he's rich as a Jew in describing somebody. Yeah, I'd never noticed it in Jane Austen before, and it's not my favorite of hers, but excuse me, but it was noticeable. It was interesting.
Did not realize that was in Jane Austen. Well, there you go. Don't forget her, her greatest work was Clueless, which had all Jewish actors. Alicia Silverstone, Paul Rudd. No, it's not all Jewish actors, but a lot of them. Anyways, yeah, so it's definitely been on my mind because people have been talking about it. It seems like more in the last, because of the Scrooge thing and the And the Scrooge thing, by the way, was weird because, it was the Ebenezer and the fact that he didn't celebrate Christmas, and that Jacob Marley might also be Jewish because his name is Jacob and he doesn't celebrate Christmas. And I don't know. I never saw it that way. I've never met a Jew named Ebenezer. I mean, I know it's a Hebrew name, but it's Hebrew words. It means the stone of my help, the rock of my help. There's a name in the Bible, Ebenezer. It's a good name. The rock, God, it's like God is my rock, my help. I mean, it's a good name, but I just never.
Biblical names were popular across the board at one point, at various points. I never thought of Ebenezer as Jewish because it's a Christmas story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, if he wasn't, if all you have to be, I mean, it would be kind of a bad rap on Christians if all you had to do to be a Christian was celebrate Christmas.
Yeah, it's a weird.
It demands a little bit more of people than that.
One would hope.
I think the story only works if he is Christian.
It only works if Ebenezer is a lapsed Christian.
Exactly, and he's supposed to be celebrating Christmas, but I guess you could read it as, well, the only people who aren't celebrating Christmas are Jews. So I didn't get that, but whatever.
Well, that wasn't true in Dickens's time, though.
Exactly. So it seems to me to be and again, it partly was because you have, just because I was also reading about John Wesley, and I don't know, I went down a rabbit hole of learning, of reading about religion in Britain. There were a lot of Christians at the time, or some religious Christians, and some, again, people turning away from Christianity, who were, against, holidays like Christmas and stuff, which they said really had nothing to do with Jesus. And in some ways you could say that Dickens's story is about being in the Christmas spirit and not being too serious about, not saying, well, this kind of fun stuff and these lighthearted meals and having family together is also good, but whatever. I mean, the English
Christmas here used to not be celebrated. You used to have to work on Christmas so that you wouldn't get drunk.
Yeah, there is that. There was a serious Puritan, kind of antipathy to Christmas. So I don't know. I mean, anyways, it was part of the discussion over these last days. And anyways, well, with that, let's turn to Samuel, which is my favorite single book of the Bible, of Genesis probably too, but these books are amazing because I think they're especially when we get into King David's cycle, they're some of the best written and most engaging stories that you'll find in any literature. I really feel that way. You really have to almost go into the last 150 years to read the kind of great novels that we started seeing in English and Western civilization. It's just amazing. I do want to mention a couple things about it as we get into it, because the book of Samuel is split into two books. A couple of things we want to say. First of all, the Samuel 1 and Samuel 2. Samuel, the first book of Samuel and the second book of Samuel, like Corinthians. It was not Jewish or classification organization to put into two books. So originally there was not two Samuel books. That was done by Christian scholars. It was in the Septuagint, and then later on, the Jewish people continued that mode. But originally it was one book. There was no separation. It starts with the end of the book of Judges, with the birth of Samuel, and goes into the death of Saul, and then through at the end of the first book, Samuel 1, and then in the second book, David taking over, and then David is all throughout 2 Samuel, and then he turns over his kingship in the beginning of the next book of the Bible, in the book of Kings. There definitely seems to be an element, and when we talk about the sources to the book, I want to say a couple things about it now. I wish we had more people here, and I'm not going to keep talking about it. So hopefully they can watch this part if they want to know. There definitely seems to be a different sources that are drawn from. Even the Talmud says that Samuel, the Talmud says that Samuel wrote the book of Samuel, with the exception of the parts after he dies, which are written by other prophets. The prophet Gad and the prophet Nathan were mentioned during the time of King David, especially Nathan, because again, they wanted it to be written by prophets. There seem to be different sources that the authors of Samuel drew on. Some of them seem to be written very close to when the events took place. That there's a sense of reportage. There's a sense of literally it's happening or just happened, unlike any other part of the Bible that we've read so far. There's also definitely a sense in some places that it's written, that some of it was written long after the events happened. There's no question, because sometimes there'll be lines that say, until this day, and this is the way it's been like until this day. And when you read that, they're definitely talking a couple hundred years in the future. So there are anachronisms in the book of Samuel, just as there were in Genesis, which tell us that it was not written at the time, that the events are being described. That being said, there's not a scholarly agreement on those sources and when they were composed. And the archaeological evidence for the events in Samuel are difficult at this stage to prove or disprove. So saying that, there hasn't been a lot of David's story that has been disproven yet. On the other hand, there hasn't been a lot that has been proven yet. We have no texts or archaeological evidence that King David ever lived. That you'll hear that being said, and that is true. The earliest references we have to David are inscriptions from the 9th century that talk about the house of David from his descendants. Is that proof that David existed? No, but it's pretty good evidence that 100 years later, 150 years later, that his descendants were still calling themselves from the dynasty, from the house of David. So again, not proof of David, but pretty good evidence that's happened. We found evidence from tombs in Jerusalem from that period that seem to indicate that there are people who lived during the time of David or right after David that lived in that area, who were buried in that area, and those all seem to be, we haven't found David's tomb or Solomon's tomb, but that those areas were definitely show that people could have been buried of wealth and prominence in that area of Jerusalem. We know that Jerusalem was inhabited during that period. The most highly excavated part of all of Israel is that we call Ir David, the city of David, which interestingly is not within the wall. It's just outside of the wall, the western wall. Actually, you'll see a part of that. You'll see a part of that excavation from the bus stop that you get out to go into the Western Wall. The city of David, you can visit. It's a tourist site. You can see some of the excavations, the remnants of the excavations. They're definitely looking for evidence of King David's existence. It's probably, if not the Holy Grail, it's pretty close to the Holy Grail, seeing as how Jesus is also supposed to be descended from David. They're looking for that too. Christians are looking for that evidence. And there definitely there are some mythological elements to the book of Samuel, but overall, it seems to be pretty pretty close to things that seem to have happened. The details and even the focus of it seems so real that it seems like, again, the sense is that this really happened. I will tell you one other thing about the book that we have in existence that we're about to look at. The book of Samuel that we have in the Masoretic text, in the Hebrew Bible, we call the Hebrew Bible, you'll see this discussed occasionally, is a not good text. Some people call it a corrupted text. Don't like the connotations of that, but that's what it's called. It's a corrupted text. There are things missing, not huge things, not necessarily anything that's going to be earth-shattering, but there are parts of the book of Samuel that were not transcribed well. We don't know why, by the way. Some people say there was political reasons for it. It doesn't seem, maybe a little bit, but it seems like most of it was really just sloppy copying. How do we know this? Because we have the Septuagint, and the Septuagint has a different text than the Hebrew Bible that we have. Occasionally you'll see notes. I think in Sepharia, there might occasionally be notes that say, this is not what it says it'll say, this is what the Septuagint says, because the Septuagint, the Greek translation, was actually clearer. If you think that's weird, understand that the Septuagint is older than the oldest copy of the Bible we have in Hebrew. The oldest copy of the Bible we have in Hebrew is the Aleppo Codex from the 10th century. The Septuagint, earliest copies we have, go back about 500, 600 years earlier. And you're going to ask yourself, well, maybe the Septuagint is wrong and the Hebrew Bible was right. The Hebrew Bible we have was the actual original, and then they fixed it. There was maybe something missing. You might say that.
What about the Dead Sea Scrolls?
That's exactly it, Judith. So when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls 7 years ago, what that did, and that's one of the most important things, by the way, about of finding the Dead Sea Scrolls was great. It was a great historical find. You know, people talk about how important it was understanding Judaism in the rabbinic period, the Greco-Roman period, understanding Christianity, the development of Christianity. All that's important from a standpoint of like what was really important about it for us in the Bible. It proved that the Septuagint was the more accurate version of the book of Samuel, because we found a lot of the book of Samuel in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Actually, in Cave 4, which is where we found most of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's actually the cave that you can see from the Qumran observation area. In Cave 4, we found 4 big texts of Samuel, and those texts agree with the Septuagint text and not with the Masoretic text, not with the Hebrew text that we have. So it was really important for us understanding what we call source criticism or textual criticism. I mean, the actual text itself, the source, the textual source. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove that the Septuagint was the correct or the original version of it. So yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls was the deciding factor on that. And so sometimes you'll see in the notes in Jewish text, it'll say the Dead Sea Scrolls will say, or the Septuagint will say, because they realize that maybe it's a better, in these cases, it's a better version. It's not a lot. It's like 3 or 4 places that you'll see it where it's usually pointed out. But yeah, it's an interesting case. Of course, that opens up, well, what about the other differences between the Septuagint and the Tanakh that we have? Are there, can we always say one's better than, you can always say the Septuagint's better? No, not necessarily. On the other hand, there aren't that many differences either, by the way, between the books. So just understand that we're not talking about in the scheme of the massive text of the Bible, we're not talking about that many scriptural variations. The problem is for Orthodox Jews to even talk about the Bible not being, not so much the Torah, obviously, but even other parts of the Bible, for it to be not the best scribal tradition. It's not part of the discussion people want to hear. So just keep that in mind. You'll see the notes occasionally. You'll see articles about the book of Samuel that, that it's a corrupted, they say it's a corrupted version. It's not, it's not that bad, but it's, and we'll point it out when we get to those places. And again, I think there'll be 2 or 3 that will point out and say, hey, look, this is why we use the Septuagint or the Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll see in a couple of weeks, I think, for the first time. So that being said, it's a really important book of the Bible. And one might argue that what happens here changes the course of Jewish history. And that's why the story is so important. That's why the story is so memorable. The story of David is kind of like, we look at the people who helped shape Judaism. We talk about Abraham, maybe we talk about Jacob, but though Abraham and Jacob definitely have more mythological roles, then we get to Moses, who also changes the course of Jewish history, but also has some mythological elements to it for sure. David, there are mythological elements to his story, but they're not the most. The most of his story is very real, very descriptive, and oftentimes very critical. And so it seems to be the least mythological story of any major character we'll meet, and also one who changes Jewish history. So with that being said, we're going to jump in. We're not going to read about David today or next week. We're going to be reading about probably like 2 or 3 weeks before, or 3 or 4 weeks before we get to meet David. But today we're going to meet Samuel. And most of the time, the person you're hearing to read this is our own Judith Stolnitz, who's on the line right now. But we're going to let Rosemary read it. And Judith, you get to listen to it this time. But Judith usually does a phenomenal job every year reading this at High Holidays. And this is the portion that we read for the Haftarah, for Rosh Hashanah. Chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the book of Samuel. Rosemary?
There was a man from Ramatayim of the Zuphites in the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. Okay, so let's just mention right there the fact that we are introduced to a man whose name is Elkanah. I thought we had an emergency just now. We don't, thankfully. He is introduced. We're introduced to this man by his lineage, by his ancestors, and it says he's from Ephraim. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that Ephraim is an area. It's the tribal portion for the people of Ephraim. But as we read in the book of Judges, not just Ephraimites live there. So when we talk about the hill country of Ephraim, we sometimes read about people living there who are Levites or who are, not from that tribe, even Judites. But it's an important area of central Israel. It was an area, again, that maybe was so important, so vital. Ephraim, there are those scholars who say that Ephraim was not a person. We in the Bible, in Genesis, we read that Manasseh and Ephraim are sons of Joseph. Some people say that the construct of Ephraim and the word Ephrati, someone who's from Ephraim, was actually a place before it was a person, and that we have an Ephraim who's mentioned because Ephraim was an important part of the land of Israel. There definitely seems to be a geographical importance to Ephraim by the way it's referred, and because the word Ephraim is a plural word, the construct is a plural. Some people feel that it was not really a person to begin with, but the important thing is it's an important part of Israel, and it's where this story is taking place, in the middle part of Israel, central part of Israel. He had 2 wives, one named Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah was childless. This man used to go up from his town every year to worship and to offer sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh. Hophni and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord there.
Yep. And so, real important, there was a shrine to God, which is where the ark was, and the tabernacle and those good stuff from the desert was at Shiloh, which is not far from Ephraim. It's in the central part of Israel, near Jerusalem, not far from Jerusalem. But this is where people would go to offer sacrifices before David's time, before David moves it to Jerusalem and makes Jerusalem the headquarters. It's in Shiloh. Now there will be a stop. It's not, there's a point where it's not actually in Shiloh. It's going to be somewhere else before it goes to Shiloh. But what's interesting about it is that if this is like the religious center of Israel, for the Israelites, it's not originally in one place. It's not in the place. It doesn't come to rest with Moses and the people when they come out of the desert in Jerusalem. It is in a temporary, or it moves. And again, I guess you can say that there are equivalents in history. Our capital moved in the United States, right? We didn't originally agree on Washington, D.C. as the capital. It was a compromise and it moved there. And in many ways, that seems to be what happened in ancient Israel, that Jerusalem was kind of a compromise, if you will. But Shiloh was this place for a good period of time, and people did come there. People did go worship there. And as we can see, Eli, the priest, he is the guy who ministers there along with his sons, Hophni and Phinehas. They will be important later on to the story. We know of another Phinehas that was a priest, right? He was Aaron's grandson. It's not that Phinehas. It's a different Phinehas. So we have, if you look at what happens here with Eli, we're going to come back to this guy and to his sons. So by the way, it says he went up every year. It doesn't say he goes 3 times a year, but he does make a yearly pilgrimage to there. And of course, we also read, very important, about the 2 wives. He's married to 2 women, Hannah and Peninnah. We've read about 2 wives before in the story of Rachel and Leah. We don't know that Hannah and Peninnah are related. They definitely have a rivalry of one having children and one who can't have children, as we're going to see that theme of Rachel and Leah is definitely in this story too. Yeah, you've got some interesting kind of tropes and themes and motifs. Barrenness, sons who don't rise to their expectations of their parents, which will be an interesting theme for Samuel and for David. Definitely as part of the story. And again, Hophni and Phinehas are Eli's sons.
What was the word for barren woman?
So interestingly here, we have the word akara, which means a barren woman. That's the word. It's like the title, and akara is the title for a woman who can't have children. That's not what it actually says here. It doesn't use that word. It says ein yeladim, that she didn't have children, which I don't want to split hairs, and I don't want to say that this is different. It's a different word, and therefore it's a different situation. But it is possible that the reason that the word was different, at least maybe there was a tradition, I don't know, keep in mind that maybe her children were born but didn't survive. So maybe they were miscarried or stillbirth, stillborn children, but that she could conceive, but she couldn't have children that lived. It's a possibility. It just says she doesn't have children, which is different than saying she's barren, which is why it doesn't say she's barren. But well, just hold off on that. I mean, I don't want to read too much. I said I wouldn't read too much into it. There could just be the author used a different word. But anyways, we'll keep going.
One such day, Elkanah offered a sacrifice. He used to give portions to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters, but to Hannah he would give one portion only, though Hannah was his favorite, for the Lord had closed her womb.
Yeah, so there it says specifically, which is why I would say, using the word barren there, I mean, there it says closed her womb seems to be she was childless and childless through not being able to have children. A closed womb, sagar rachma, is not a very common phrase, by the way. We don't have that phrase in the Bible a lot. But again, it's another way of saying childless, but in this case, it's that the womb was closing.
What phrase is used to describe Sarah?
Let's take a quick look. Let us read the first time that we when is the first time that we read she cannot have kids? I think when she asks for Hagar to take her place. So let's go 15 and see what it says here. Here, Abraham says that he doesn't have children.
What's his word?
He says,
Where is it?
he says, Mati Tenli.
Monty.
Holech. Okay, so he says, Holech Ariri. I mean that I'll go. That's Holech means to go, but he means to go to the great beyond. It's Ariri is the word that's used there. Aror.
Okay.
So then look at this one. That's where he says that maybe Eliezer is supposed to be so that's where he says he's childless. That's interesting that he actually says that he's childless to begin with. It's the first time we hear it.
Sarah's Abraham's wife had borne him no children.
Yeah, and there it says Lo Yalda. She has not had children.
He's not had children.
That's the same introduction like we had to Hannah.
Anna, yeah.
But here it says, the Lord has kept me from bearing. So it says, Atzarani Adonai miledet, that God has not let me bear. Like stopped me from bearing. Right? So that's what she says there. So that's different. So that's that one. And then let's look at one other place where he talks about it.
I will give her a son.
Well, there she says,
About
she says, can I bear a child? But then she doesn't say,
Taled.
Doesn't say it.
I didn't realize that it also said that Abraham laughed. I never remember that Sarah laughed, but
Oh yeah. Not only did he fell
threw
down.
himself out. He was rolling on the floor laughing.
Oh yeah. No, we read this not too long ago in in our Wednesday night class. Yeah, we
That's
didn't
what I
talk
get
too
for
much about the
skipping
fact that he
lunch.
fell down on the floor. He did a spit take. No, he didn't. He fell down on the ground laughing. It's even better. So here's the last one.
Sarah will have a son.
And here she says, it says, Sarah was old,
Oh,
and Bayamim
Anashim.
Hadal, she stopped having periods. That's what it says there. She doesn't have, she didn't
The
have,
way of women.
was not on her anymore. She wasn't like women. Like she, it's not.
Yeah.
And by the way, that the word orach is the word for being, it's the word for being visited. It's the word for it's for a visit. Orach is a visitor, is a guest.
Oh, it's their euphemism.
Yep.
Yeah, but we say, she's visiting, or whatever the phrase is, her monthly visit. So so that's Sarah's descriptions. As you can see, that's Sarah's, those are the descriptions of Sarah's childbearing. So you see, we've not had that phrase closed up her womb. Now, by the way, we can just quickly look at two of the other ladies. One of them we're going to meet officially in our Wednesday night class next week, or this week, tomorrow night. If we go to Rebecca, which is the beginning of chapter, not the beginning, but in chapter 25. What does it say about Rebecca? She was barren. There uses the word akara. Now, I'm not sure that that's the first usage of the word akara of barren, but it's definitely, I think it is actually, but I'm not 100% sure if that's the first usage of the word akara, but there it is. And then,
and how about Rachel? What does she get?
I'm just going to give you Rachel's description.
Rachel was barren.
Rachel was akara. Yep, she was barren. Yep. And there you have it. Give me children, or I shall die. And Jacob, I don't want to we're going to read this Wednesday night, pretty soon. Jacob was incensed at Rachel and said, "Can I take the place of God, who has denied you the fruit of the womb?" Not the fruit of the loom, but fruit of the womb. Pri vaten, which is another phrase for not having, fruit of the womb is another phrase for children, which she doesn't have, that you don't have, that you have not been given fruit of the womb. So it's
You can see how important it is by how many words they have for it. Like in Eskimo, they've got so many words for snow. Eskimo's not the word, but so many different words.
Yeah, you're right. So it was definitely important. There are euphemisms for it. There are different, different poetic ways of saying it. But akara is a woman in particular who's barren. So there's actually a Hebrew word specifically for a barren woman, which we don't have in English. We say a barren woman, but in Hebrew it's an akara. It's an actual, like a mourner or a soldier or whatever. It's something you are. It's a state of being. So, but we are going to get that word, by the way, here.
So you're a wife, you're a son, you're a daughter, you're a barren.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
you're a barren woman. It's a title. You're an akara. So you're going to see the phrase. I mean, we also have a virgin. I mean, a virgin's also a Betula is or an Alma is also a different woman, a different state. A Na'ara for a man, for a young man, is also a different state. So yeah, but it's interesting. And by the way, I thank you, Judith, for looking at that, because those stories are also here in the back of our mind. When we read the story of Hannah and Penina, we are immediately drawn to the Rachel Leah story and the matriarchs in the past who have this issue. So all of this is relevant. All of this should be in our minds, and lots of stuff that we read in Judges should be in our minds too. That's the book that just finished, but there's going to be some things we read about there. So again, here's what happens with the sacrifices.
Moreover, her rival, to make her miserable, would taunt her that the Lord had closed her womb. This happened year after year. Every time she went up to the house of the Lord, the other would taunt her, so that she wept and would not eat.
Wow. So what should have been a cause for celebration, this pilgrimage turns into a disaster for her.
Family tension on the holidays. Oh, that never happens now.
Yeah. It's also, by the way, but in all seriousness, this is what, this is when the rabbis would talk about the friction caused by polygamy. They would say, why would anyone willingly open themselves up to this type of tension? Because it's natural when you have a competition between wives that you're going to have this kind of thing. And this is the worst. This is the extreme version of it. When somebody, it could be that your kid is smarter or funnier or better than the other wife's kids. But here, the other wife can't even have kids. And so she's not even in the race. It's just terrible. And so it basically says Penina made it even worse by taunting her, which again, we also kind of have a little bit in the story of Sarah and Hagar. At least she feels that Hagar, once she has a baby, once she's pregnant, is actually pregnant, not even have the baby, that she's already starting to look down on Sarah. So there is that Handmaid's Tale. So with that, this was not something that people would want to do. So what are we going to do? What's Elkanah going to do?
Her husband Elkanah said to her, Hannah, why are you crying and why aren't you eating? Why are you so sad? Am I not more devoted to you than 10 sons? After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose. The priest Eli was sitting on the seat near the doorpost of the temple of the Lord.
Yeah, so just to look at that previous paragraph, that previous verse. So her husband tries to comfort her. Elkanah says to her, don't be upset. I love you, and my love is, it's worth having. It's equal to having sons, of course. She's being protected. He's taking care of her. She shouldn't have to worry about being taken care of because he's taking care of her. And he's devoted to her. He's taking care of her. Obviously, what's interesting about this story too, which you may not have noticed before, is that her sadness, her depression is affecting her eating. See that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you can see, and by the way, she's not the only character we're going to read about in Samuel who stops eating. David stops eating when he's sad. So there you have it. There's a little bit in the Bible about the connection between eating and depression and or not eating and depression. And we find stuff in the Bible that we're learning more about, but also recognize that they knew that it's had an effect on your physical health and on other aspects of who you were. But again, he's able to get her to eat and drink a little bit. And then she's going to come into contact with the priest, Eli. So let's see what happens. And it says he's sitting at the seat near the doorpost of the temple. So he's out by the temple. He's in that area. By the way, they call it the temple of the Lord. They don't just call it a tabernacle. They actually call it a Heichal Adonai, which seems to be a little bit more than just a temporary tabernacle. They just had the tent up, if you will. And it says all mezuzot, which is, again, the doorpost, right? So the mezuzah is not the scroll. It's a doorpost. A mezuzah is a doorpost. We now call the mezuzah scroll the mezuzah, but it's actually the doorpost. And it does seem like it's a door, not I guess you could say the door to the tent, but it seems to be more of a fixed structure than just a temporary tent that we have up, like a carnival tent. Doesn't seem like that. So just keep that in mind too.
In her wretchedness, she prayed to the Lord, weeping all the while. And she made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if you will look upon the suffering of your maidservant and will remember me and not forget your maidservant, and if you will grant your maidservant a male child, I will dedicate him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor shall ever touch his head.
Yeah, and why I said it's important to remember what just happened in Judges, because we sometimes forget that Samuel is a little bit of a Nazirite too. In this case, he's also a Nazirite from birth, because his mother makes a promise that if you give me a child, God, I'm going to make him a Nazirite. So we don't know a lot about the Nazirites, how many there were, how often this happened. The Bible talks about it. We have really only two cases of people that we know for a fact are Nazirites, Samson and Samuel, but we assume it was more common than that. There's a chapter in the book of Numbers dedicated to the Nazirites. There's a tractate of the Talmud that deals with the Nazirites and oaths of that nature. But this definitely seems to be consistent with what we think happens with Nazirites, which are people make promises to God and say, God, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. And it seems like normally people did it for themselves and would say, I'm going to do it for myself. But it seems like in rare cases, or maybe it wasn't that rare, where people were like, I can't have a baby. Maybe I have to do something to dedicate this child to God, that I will make a promise that if I have a baby, that he's going to be your baby, God. And there are people who've done that throughout history. I mean, there are people who did that it was a little easier, I guess, maybe in the Catholic Church, where you could have a child essentially become a priest. We didn't quite have that, in the sense that if you became a rabbi, or there's no big deal about doing that, or dedicating your child and saying, I'm going to make sure my child will become a rabbi, because it was more, you didn't have that. You didn't know whether they would become a rabbi. You couldn't say, I'm going to be a rabbi. You had to prove that you could be a rabbi, or you had to go through the schooling and the stuff. You couldn't just be turned over to the church. There was no authority that could take your Jewish baby and say, well, we're going to make him something now. So we didn't have that, but we did during the time of Samuel through the Judges. And we don't know when the Nazirite laws essentially stopped for good until the temple was destroyed. So once the temple was destroyed, you couldn't be a Nazirite anymore. But we don't know how frequent it was up until the temple was destroyed. It seems by the time of the Maccabees that it was not a very common thing. We don't have discussions in the books of Maccabees about it. We don't have discussions in Josephus about it. There were Essenes who were doing pretty similar things, in the sense that they were dedicating themselves to God, maybe even being celibate. There was definitely some of that, but it wasn't exactly Nazirite behavior. So definitely not something that the rabbis encouraged. They didn't want people to take on responsibilities and oaths that were difficult and too much for people. But yeah, Samuel is dedicated like Samson was from birth. In this case, the mom says it in the story of Samson. The angel tells the parents, this is what you got to do. So it's a little different, but, similar enough that there, and again, the only cases we have of these Nazarites that we know for sure that someone was a Nazarite. So here is what happens.
As she crept on praying before the Lord, Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah was praying in her heart. Only her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Sober up."
So the word, and it probably will say it here, remove your wine from you. That's the hasiri et yenecha me'alecha, which seems to be like the phrase for sober up. Get the wine, or let's see how they translate. Remove your wine from you. Technically, hasir comes from the same root as put away the wine or hide the wine. hide the wine. But he accuses her of being drunk, and she's just praying, but she doesn't say anything out loud, I guess, because it says her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. So whatever she's doing is not the way people normally did it. And it freaks Eli out. He accuses her of being drunk, which is not really a nice thing, right? It's not,
Drunk in public.
Yeah, it doesn't really speak highly for Eli that he totally misjudged the situation.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't make him look great, by the way, which,
because it was
Especially
a
since she's
woman.
been coming every year,
woman.
you'd think he'd be familiar with her problem.
yeah, and Eli doesn't look great in this book of Samuel. He does not. Just keep in mind that our first introduction to him, he makes a very rash judgment about somebody, unjustified, and it's humiliating because she's actually praying really hard and he's accusing her of being drunk in public, which is a sin. So it's a really bad situation. So it does not make him look great. The first introduction to our priest of the Lord is not a good one. And we know that Hannah is just pouring out her heart, right? She's pouring out her heart to God.
And Hannah replied, "Oh, no, my lord, I'm a very unhappy woman. I have drunk no wine or other strong drink, but I have been pouring out my heart to the Lord. Do not take your maidservant for a worthless woman. I have only been speaking all this time out of my great anguish and distress."
Yeah, it's a beautiful phrase that she says, a very powerful phrase, right? And she says, "I'm an unhappy woman. Asher keshat ruach. My spirit is upset. Is taken." And she says, "I haven't drunk wine, and by the way, we have not just yain, but shachar, the alcohol, spirits. It's like a shecher, where we get the word sheker, right? In Hebrew, Yiddish, it's intoxicants. She says, I haven't had anything like that. I haven't been drinking. And the phrase that she uses in return is, I'm pouring out my heart. And it's such a beautiful turn of phrase, right? I'm not pouring alcohol, I'm pouring out my heart. So it's just the language of it is so beautiful, because she could have just said, I'm praying, right? I'm praying with my heart. She says, I'm pouring out my heart. Very, very powerful phrase because of the alcohol pouring, right? It's the play off of that. Very powerful language. It's the example, like I'm saying, of how beautiful the language is here and how complex and how nuanced it is. And again, if it doesn't come through in Hebrew, in the English, I'll point it out in the Hebrew, but it works in English too. All right.
Then go in peace, said Eli, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him.
Yeah, not I'm sorry. Yeah,
Right.
maybe we wouldn't expect the priest of essentially the high priest at the time. We wouldn't expect him to maybe apologize. It would have been nice, but maybe that wasn't the expectation anyways. Was he embarrassed? I don't know. But he does say, may God grant you your prayer. And maybe she felt better after being told that by the high priest. And he essentially was like the Kohen Gadol, Eli. Yeah. I think I mentioned this. There's a midrash that Eli, who is the son, the grandson of Aaron through Itamar, so Aaron has 4 sons, right? Nadav and Avihu both get burned up for offering up bad fire before God. Then you have Eleazar, who his son Pinchas ends up being the priest. And then you have Itamar, the other son, whose descendant is Eli. Now there's a tradition we kind of talked about, I think we mentioned, there's a midrash that because Pinchas was not a good high priest, that the priesthood got taken away from his line and given to Eli and through the Itamar line for a brief period. Doesn't exactly say that. It doesn't say Eli is high priest. Seems like he's in charge. So did it get past there? But we're going to see. It goes back to the Pinchas, to the Eleazar line. So let me rephrase that. If it ever went away from the Pinchas line, it's going to go back. You'll see why. So Eli, maybe there's some magic to that, some power to it. I don't know. But here's her response.
She answered, you are most kind to your handmaid. So the woman left, and she ate and was no longer downcast.
Okay, so it seemed like she'd eaten before, but maybe she didn't. But whatever, she eats now. And she's also not sad anymore. So.
Early next morning, they bowed low before the Lord, and they went back home to Ramah. Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her.
Yeah, so if you look at the other times where we have the word no, here, yeah, I mean, it makes sense that he knew his wife. Does anyone want to say anything about that, by the way? It seems obvious. He had sex with his wife, and they use the word he knew his wife. Any other times that we just flash back, we did a little flashback and went back and read those texts. In the case of Abraham, it doesn't say that he knew his wife and she had a baby.
It just says God remembered her.
Yeah. Now, I don't want to read too much into that, but I didn't read this into it. Somebody else did a long time ago. There are midrashim that not abound, but they're there, and they were picked up in other places. And if you want to know that Jesus is not the first immaculate conception that we read about in Jewish history, understand that Isaac and perhaps even Moses in some of the midrashim suggest that these are children that God placed in a womb without any help from another human man. That doesn't mean, of course, that the child didn't have some part of, that God didn't clone Abraham, because the Bible clearly says that Abraham was the father of Isaac. The Bible actually repeats it 3 times that Abraham fathered Isaac. But because it didn't say that he had sex with his wife, it allowed the rabbis to open up a possibility that it was kind of a special birth. I'm just going to tell you, there are Jewish versions of this that were pervasive at the time of Jesus, even amongst the more rational. Well, Philo, who was a Greek Jew living in Alexandria before the time of Jesus, just before the time of Jesus, but during the time of the rabbis or the early rabbis, during the time of the temple was still standing in Jerusalem. He was a Greek Jew, and he said that Isaac was placed there by God. He had he was a Greek Jew, Jewish Hellenistic writer, rational writer. It wasn't, he tried to synthesize Judaism and Platonic thought. He said that Isaac was an immaculate birth, or a immaculate conception. Yeah, so it wasn't beyond the pale of what Jews would maybe could accept at the time. Just think about that. So it does say that he knew his wife, and that's not always there. So we don't know how old, by the way, Hannah is at this point. She could be, also not beyond the time of women having periods, right? So, by the way, it doesn't mean that Abraham and Sarah had stopped having sex when she didn't have her period anymore, but biologically, she shouldn't have been able to have a child, is what the Bible is telling us, without a doubt. All right. So very much like we read with the other matriarchs.
Hannah conceived and at the turn of a year bore a son. She named him Samuel, meaning, I asked the Lord for him. And when the man Elkanah and all his household were going up to offer the Lord the annual sacrifice and his votive sacrifice, Hannah did not go up. She said to her husband, when the child is weaned, I will bring him. For when he has appeared before the Lord, he must remain there for good.
Wow. Okay. So very much like Sarah comes back the next year as a baby. Or when we come back to her the next year, she doesn't come back. She says, I can't go back because when I go back with him, he's not coming back home. So she says to her husband, and we don't know that he knew this before, I made a promise to God that he's going to be God's. And so I am going to go back when I bring him there. Pretty wild. So there's some elements like Moses a little bit here of the mom who has to give up her child a little bit, right? We don't know how old he was going to be when he was weaned. There are some kids who don't get weaned until they're 6 or 7. But we probably say 3 or 4, maybe 5, maybe, but probably 2 or 3 normally was when the child was weaned in the biblical period, we think. And the word that's used here is yigamel, the word yigamel, weaned. And maybe she delayed his weaning because she knew once he was weaned, he's got to leave the house. I assume he wasn't 13 or 14 when he was weaned, but that would have been.
It's always the way I
People
read
are
it.
being
was that he
advised
was,
to delay weaning now because in
4
order to give their
Yeah. Some people say that, it affects your natural cycle of being able to have a child. It's not a good way of maintaining your family plan, if you will.
there's a theory that it prevents breast cancer too.
Correct. That's not.
It also is very hard on your bones.
Yes.
Mm.
I don't. I will only tell you, we don't know. It does call him a na'ar, young man, young boy. It's not a child. It's not a yeled. So it's possible that he was older than normal when he was weaned, but I could definitely see this Jewish mother trying to protect her son and keep him. I made a promise, but I didn't say when. I just said when he's weaned. I didn't say how old he was going to be. He's a 20-year-old. He's weaned at 20. It's getting older and older. So they're still weaning. Yes, what he said, weaning. He didn't, yeah, we don't know how old he is, but he's, well, first of all, just let's see what Elkanah says to this.
Her husband Elkanah said to her, do as you think best. Stay home until you have weaned him. May the Lord fulfill his word. So the woman stayed home and nursed her son until she weaned him.
Yeah.
When she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with 3 bulls, 1 ephah of flour, and a jar of wine. And though the boy was still very young, she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh.
Yeah, and so it doesn't say how old he is, but it says he is. It says he's a nar. He says he's a nar, nar. He's still young. He's young. He's young. He's younger than when people would normally probably start their road of assistance in the priesthood. But she decided when he was weaned, right? That was her cutoff. This is quite a big offering that she brings up, right? It's 3 bulls that's like the top, like 1 bull would have been already the top offering, but 3 bulls is a huge offering. But again, this was something that she was,
They named something after her.
this is a big offering. Yeah, she's definitely getting recognized at the temple bulletin. Yeah. Anyways, so yeah. So that is her offering. And what do they say?
After slaughtering the bull, they brought the boy to Eli. She said, please, my lord, as you live, my lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you and prayed to the Lord.
Wow. So she tells him, who, remember me? I'm that lady that was praying, and she doesn't say, and you thought I was drunk, but I was.
Now there's only 1 bull.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could say it was the last bull or whatever, but yeah, it doesn't say the bulls, but after slaughtering the bull, by the way, I don't know, maybe there's a better, maybe that is better in the other text, but yeah, but maybe that was the last bull, she says.
It was this boy I prayed for, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. I, in turn, hereby lend him to the Lord, for as long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. And they bowed low there before the Lord.
Yeah, so the word lend here is a play on the word Shaul, and he says Hishilti, and it's a play on the word I've asked for. It's it's a lend, but he's lent for as long as he lives. So it's not a lend situation. Yeah, I mean, he's dedicated to God. But it's more, again, the word Sha'al and Shaul here is a play on, this is what I asked for, and this is what now is God's. It's God's. So look, she is an amazing woman because she follows through on her vow. She sees her son as definitely a gift from God, that she just is honored to be part of the process, if you will. She feels that her life has now had a purpose. Folks, she's one of the heroes of Jewish history, from the sense that she puts into motion the life of the Kingmaker. She's the one who prays to God and has him so that he can do what he's going to do, which is change the course of history. The book that we're read about King David is not called the Book of David. It's called the Book of Samuel. And he was the prophet who made this all happen. So he's both a prophet, he's a judge, as we're going to see. He is the Kingmaker. And as we're about to read, Hannah's prayer might be one of the older parts of the Bible. Again, an example of a text that maybe the narrative was built around. So we have a poem or a song, prayer that was built, was there, and then the narrative was kind of built around it to explain it. This one definitely seems to be spot on. So like in the story of Job, in Jonah, we have the Jonah prayer, which is a little different than Jonah, the book of Jonah. In the song of the sea, it's not much different, but it seems a little different maybe than the narrative. This one seems pretty spot on, and we'll take a look at it, and it's probably where we're gonna conclude. We'll see. This is the song or the prayer of Hannah.
And Hannah prayed, "My heart exults in the Lord. I have triumphed through the Lord. I gloat over my enemies. I rejoice in your deliverance. There is no holy one like the Lord. Truly, there is none beside you. There is no rock like our God."
And again, this is a much more powerful phrase in Hebrew, because it's a threefold prayer. Ein kadosh kadonai. There's none holy. Ein biltecha. The ein tzur Elohim. So it's a three. There is none. There is none. There is none. And it's part of it. It's a very powerful part of the prayer. Okay.
Talk no more with lofty pride. Let no arrogance cross your lips. For the Lord is an all-knowing God. By him actions are measured. The bows of the mighty are broken, and the faltering are girded with strength. Men once sated must hire out for bread. Men once hungry, hunger no more. While the barren woman bears 7, the mother of many is forlorn.
Yeah, and here we have the word akara, the barren woman. So there it is. We have the word akara attached to Hannah. Assuming she's talking about herself here, right? Though it doesn't say that she's going to bear 7, or doesn't say here yet that she's had 7, but oh my gosh, does she think that now that she's had a child that she's going to have more children?
Is that related to the other Hannah who has 7 sons?
Might be. It might be why we have a Hannah and her 7 sons that we have in the book of Maccabees. Oh yeah. Yeah. We'll talk about why Hannah's so special. But here's this interesting idea that this is the idea that she was only going to have 1 child makes the offering even more powerful, right? But if she's thinking, oh, maybe this is the beginning of having children. And when she's talking about the mother of many being forlorn, that is also assuming that there's somebody else, maybe someone that she knows really well, who's not going to have good things happen to her. It's not good if you're Penina.
The Lord deals death and gives life, casts down into Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He casts down, but he also lifts high.
Yeah, so this is God that can be a little scary. This is not a God that only does Good stuff. By the way, if God casts someone down to Sheol and then also raises them up, is that supposed to be figurative, or is this an allusion to somebody actually being brought back to life or being resurrected? Possible. It also could be a poetic phrase, which is, he can send someone to hell, but also bring them back up. And, when we say I went to hell, I've been to hell and back, it doesn't mean you literally went to hell, right? So it could be used in that same type of poetic way. There are people who say, no, this is an allusion to being resurrected or going to heaven after going to hell. That you go to Gehenna and then you go up then after that to it's possible, but it also is possible that this is a poem, a prayer, and that this is an example of it. So let's take a look.
He raises the poor from the dust, lifts up the needy from the dunghill, setting them with nobles, granting them seats of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's. He has set the world upon them.
Yeah. This is
A little prosperity gospel.
yeah, it is. And yeah, it basically can be a rags to, God makes rags to riches stories happen. And that's up to God. Yep.
He guards the steps of his faithful, but the wicked perish in darkness. For not by strength shall man prevail. The foes of the Lord shall be shattered. He will thunder against them in the heavens. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give power to his king and triumph to his anointed one.
Yeah. That's a weird phrase, because there are no kings yet.
So she's prophesying.
Uh-huh.
Or it's written backwards.
Yeah. And so that's an interesting phrase, because again, this is exactly what the phrase means, though if you look at what the phrase actually means in Hebrew, will raise the horn of. And again, that's the horn, we assume it's the horn of Vayeram Karen means to raise up the horn, and we assume that's the horn of oil for anointing. So they would pour out the oil of anointing, which is exactly what Samuel does. Samuel is the first guy to do that. He's going to pour out the oil on Saul. He's going to pour out the oil on David, and he is the kingmaker with that oil, with that Karen. He is going to make the Mashiach. That's what the word Meshicho means, his anointed one. So Moshiach is the anointed one. That's what the word Meshicho means. It doesn't mean what you think it means or what we've been told it means for the last 2,000 years, as we normally associate it with Christ, the Messiah. Jesus is the Christ, is the Messiah. That's the Greek version of the word Mashiach. But it is the anointed one, and which is why the translation here is the anointed one and not triumph to his Messiah. You read Christian translations and it's not going to say that. It will say to his Messiah. They'll, every time you have the word Moshiach, they're going to translate it. They're not going to translate it. They're going to transliterate it as Messiah, right? Because Messiah is the English transliteration version of the word Moshiach. So that's what it says. And what's interesting is it says that the power of the king comes through God, because the Lord will judge the ends of the earth. The foes of the Lord will be shattered. This is God's power, and God will give the king power one day. Interesting, right? So this is all part of Hannah's prayer.
Then Elkanah and Hannah went home to Ramah, and the boy entered the service of the Lord under the priest Eli. Now, Eli's.
Hold a second. So that's the end. So that's the end of the prayer. And all Elkanah, and it doesn't say Hannah went home, but in parentheses, we assume that she went home. And the boy stays under service with the priest, with Eli HaKohen. So Eli Cohen, that's his name. Eli Cohen. He is Eli HaKohen, and he is a this is the way her prayer ends. I do want to say, before we move on from her prayer, this is the most elaborate, descriptive prayer we've had in the Bible up until now. There is no prayer like this that we've read. It just doesn't exist. Not Abraham, not Isaac, not Jacob, not Moses. Most of the prayers that we read in the Bible, period, from start to finish, are 2 or 3 lines. You know, the priestly benediction is 3 lines. El na rafan Allah, please God heal her, is 1 line, 6 words, whatever. This is a prayer. I mean, this is a whole prayer. It's a song, it's a prayer, it's a text. It's unique so far in the Bible. It's unique in Jewish history, to the extent that the rabbis say that Hannah is actually the model of prayer in the Bible. So when you were talking about people in the Bible who do certain things, you know, David is a warrior, Abraham is a man of faith, all the things that we say about Moses, the teacher, Moses, the prophet. Hannah is the exemplar of prayer. The rabbis actually say that if you want to understand how someone should pray, look at Hannah. So she's not only elevated as a matriarch here, but she's actually used as a template for what men are supposed to do when they pray. And so this isn't like, women should all be like Hannah. The rabbis say, you as a man, when you're praying, you should be like Hannah. She's the example of prayer, which is why we have it, why it's in the Bible, and why it's so important, because, to some extent, her prayers change history. Her prayers give her a child who's going to be dedicated to God. She lives up on that. She not only prays, she does what she says she's going to do in her prayer. She delivers. And then her prayer is so powerful that, essentially she puts into motion what her son is going to do. And she literally, is able to rock the foundations, of heaven with her prayers. So she's considered to be the example for men and women, for everybody. So that's Hannah's prayer. It's so important that we read it every year at Rosh Hashanah. We don't just read about Samuel's birth and say, that's a nice story. We actually read the story of Samuel's birth so that we can read to this. We finish with this line, with the last verse. We don't keep read. We actually read this line. This is the last line in the Haftarah. So what do you think, Judith, now that you've read this every year for years?
It's different listening. It's just different. I'm listening.
Is there any parts of this now that resonated in a different way that you've heard it rather than read it?
I guess the prayer part resonates differently when I'm not reading it. Hearing more of the poetry of it than when I read it myself.
Yeah. Look, there's a hope in this prayer. There's a hope in this prayer that bad things can get turned around. I mean, to some extent, if you could say, well, what's the theme of the prayer? I mean, it definitely there's not one theme. I mean, there talks about God doing great things and God's going to eventually destroy his enemies. I mean, all the things that we see in songs and prayers and the stuff that we've read already in the Bible, the Song of the Sea, the Song of Miriam. It is interesting, by the way, that the songs that and the prayers that we read in the Bible are oftentimes ascribed to women, right? So the Song of Moses and Miriam, but it's Miriam's song, whatever you want to call it. You have the Song of Deborah. Now you have Miriam's prayer. So these texts are all attached to women in one way or the other. I mean, if you're going to say that Moses is also attached to the Song of the Sea, it's still also the Song of Miriam. There's no question. The Bible says that. So these songs are attached to women. So we would take out of this, though, that this prayer, this pouring out of the soul, is directed to us to remind us it's here. It's the theme of things can get turned around, right? If you think about it, men, once hungry or hungry no more. I mean, also go the other way too, right? The barren woman now has kids. The Lord can bring people up from the dust. It is within God's power to change our destiny, or change the situation that we're in. It's not our destiny, it's our current state. And one could say that type of prayer is on our minds right now. That type of prayer of saying, you know what, things aren't going well right now. Let's hope and pray that they get changed around. Not to give up hope, and that in the darkest places of our minds, there is a chance for us to come out of it. And so her prayer is really a prayer of hope, a prayer that even when it's the darkest, it doesn't have to stay that way. And it's a beautiful prayer of we can get out of this. And look, I don't know, we're in our darkest days right now, but we're definitely not having happy days right now, for sure. And so that's the kind of prayer that we can be thinking about, saying to ourselves now, is that this doesn't have, we don't have to stay like this. It's not going to stay like this. It is it's a prayer for today. And yeah. So we'll finish with this chapter. We'll finish the end of the chapter, but it's not good at home for Ellie. The Elkanah and Hannah go home. By the way, we don't really know what happens to Peninnah. The Midrash has that bad things happen to her, which is why she says the mother of many. It turned on Peninnah. Like there was a point where Hannah had nothing and Peninnah had everything, and then it flips.
There are all sorts of fictionalized versions of this story, like a la the Red Tent, where they take the midrash and use it in literature.
Yeah. And there's look, some of the midrash goes, some of the, so I mean, like by the way, there is a midrash that Hannah actually asked Elkanah to marry Penina because she couldn't have kids, and it was like 10 years. It's like a Hagar type story, which is that, it was Penina who gets introduced into the family for the same reasons that for 10 years she can't have a baby, and then it doesn't, like, we would expect, it doesn't go well. But there's an interesting midrash that Penina, you have to really stretch for this one, that Penina actually did something good by taunting her, which is getting her to pray. I don't know. To me, that seemed like a little bit of a stretch, but Penina actually does her job by taunting her and going, well, you better, if you don't do this, if you don't get a child, you better get on it and start praying. I don't know. It seems to be a little bit of a getting her off the hook, but it doesn't seem like she does anything good. But we're going to read about what's happening back at home with Eli and his family.
Now Eli's sons were scoundrels. They paid no heed to the Lord. This is how the priests used to deal with the people. When anyone brought a sacrifice, the priest's boy would come along with a three-pronged fork while the meat was boiling, and he would thrust it into the cauldron or the kettle or the great pot or the small cooking pot, and whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take away on it. This was the practice at Shiloh with all the Israelites who came there.
Yeah, so that's the normal practice.
But now, even before the suet was turned into smoke, the priest's boy would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, hand over some meat to roast for the priest, for he won't accept boiled meat from you, only raw. And if the man said to him, let them first turn the suet into smoke and then take as much as you want, he would reply, no, hand it over at once or I'll take it by force.
Yeah, and so this does not seem to be kosher, if you will. This is not the way the priest should be behaving. They're pre-selecting what parts of the meat that they want, taking the best parts, obviously, which again, it wasn't like they were going to get bad parts to begin with, but they're making it even worse. They're making it even, they're literally like saying, no, you're not going to take that and offer it up. So it's shortchanging God. We're going to take more for ourselves and less of it's going to go to God. And if people argued with him, it says they just made him do it anyways. They threatened him. They didn't just say, this is what you're going to do. And if the people complied, great. If not, they didn't. No, if they didn't do it, they would threaten to beat him up.
The sin of the young men against the Lord was very great, for the men treated the Lord's offerings. Samuel was engaged in the service of the Lord as an attendant, girded with a linen ephod. His mother would also make a little robe for him and bring it up to him every year when she made the pilgrimage with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice.
Yeah, so this is what's going on in Eli's house. His sons are not good people. They're running a scam. They are
Skimming.
They're literally skimming off the top.
Literally skimming.
Yeah, and it is as Samuel's watching this go down.
Then they're taking the fat too.
Yep.
So tastier.
And it's stuff that, again, it's not like they're already getting stuff. They just would take more. They couldn't. They were so greedy. And it says Samuel was watching this happen. He's doing his thing, and it says his mother would make a little robe for him, which is a nice, it says a little robe. It doesn't say, so we assume that he's
Still young.
He's not
Not fully grown.
right? Because she's still making a little robe for him, which is a me'il. That's the word for the garment that she makes for him, a robe. She makes for him a robe, and he brings it up to him, and she sees him once a year, it seems, right? It seems like that's her annual pilgrimage to making the sacrifice. She gets to visit her son. So this is what's going on. And so the visit seems like a nice thing, but what's going on in the background is not a good thing.
Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, "May the Lord grant you offspring by this woman in place of the loan she made to the Lord." Then they would return home. For the Lord took note of Hannah. She conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. Young Samuel, meanwhile, grew up in the service of the Lord.
So here it specifically says that she had more children. So she gave this child up, and she gets 5 more in return. So it's all good for her in that she not only has a child serving the Lord, but she's got now kids back at home. So it changed her dynamic. So when she prays, when she's talking about the fact that, she's going to get, she's got so much more in return than just having Samuel. That's what it says. It says that she did. So we have to remember, she did do something very honorable. She made a sacrifice, if you will, but she also get something in return.
But it's a true sacrifice because she didn't know she'd go on and have 8 million kids.
She didn't have 8 million. She had 5, but she had 5 kids. She had a normal kind of situation when she didn't think she was going to have any. So yes. And there seems to be this idea that making a promise like that and delivering on your promise will get you something in return, which is a little scary. By the ramifications of that are frightening, because it basically means if you make the right kind of sacrifice, that God's going to listen to your prayer. Otherwise, you're screwed. That's kind of sad, scary. It's weird. And it gets to the root of the bigger issue, which is now, folks, do you understand why child sacrifice was so practiced in the ancient world? Because if you honestly believed that if you were going to sacrifice a child, that you'd get the children in return, how many people would then make that deal, especially when infant mortality was so high? So again, he's not dead. It's not that level of sacrifice, but in the sense that she doesn't get to be with her son every day, but once a year, whatever, 1 week a year, a few days a year, it is a huge sacrifice. So you can kind of see the logic of what people would do when they would sacrifice literally a child on an altar.
Now,
Yep, keep going.
Now Eli was very old when he heard all that his sons were doing to all Israel and how they lay with the women who performed tasks at the entrance of the tent of meeting. He said to them, "Why do you do such things? I get evil reports about you from the people on all hands. Don't, my sons. It is no favorable report I hear the people of the Lord spreading about. If a man sins against a man, God may pardon him. But if a man offends against the Lord, who can obtain pardon for him?" But they ignored their father's plea, for the Lord was resolved that they should die.
Yeah. So there seems to be not just an issue of skimming off the top, but they're also, if you notice, the meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain. What were these women doing? What were these women doing? Now, assuming they're washing or they're part of the ritual stuff that's going on, we don't know what they were doing, but their job is not to be sleeping with Eli and with Eli's sons, with Hophni and Pinchas. That's for sure. So these are not good people on any level. They're taking advantage of God. They're taking advantage of people. They're taking advantage of people who are supposed to be taking care of God. It's a mess. And Eli can't get his sons to straighten out. And this is the oldest story in the book. The minister's sons that are misbehaving, the rabbi's children getting out of hand. This is really
Teachers'
bad.
kids are the worst.
Yeah. I will say that as of now, I should keep my mouth shut. My children have done very little to make me embarrassed or to humiliate me. But it happens far too frequently. Yeah, this is bad. This is an extreme situation. And Eli's logic is, who's going to intervene for you? If you hurt a person, maybe you can go to God and ask for forgiveness, and maybe God can perform a miracle for you. Who do you got to go to if you're wrong? God. There's nobody above. There's nobody you can do any teshuva with other than, God. I mean, what are you going to do? And so God, it says right there, they're gone. They're gone.
Young Samuel, meanwhile, grew in esteem and favor, both with God and with men. A man of God came to Eli and said to him, "Thus said the Lord, lo, I revealed myself to your father's house in Egypt when they were subject to the house of Pharaoh. And I chose them from among all the tribes of Israel to be my priests, to ascend my altar, to burn incense, and to carry an ephod before me. And I assigned to your father's house all offerings by fire of the Israelites."
Okay. So a man of God. Is this a man or is it an angel? I don't know. Ish Elohim. A man of God. It seems as though when we read about a man of God in Judges, we thought he was a man, but it turned out he was an angel. So we've had that phrase before. But this is a warning to Eli that things are going wrong. Well, we're going to see what happens, what you're supposed to do. And you can see, by the way, as this is happening, that little line there, Samuel is doing what you're supposed to do. And people love him, and God loves him. Hanar Shmuel, as a young man, Samuel is on the straight and narrow. Just remember something. Very soon, and it's not long, not far in the future, as we read through the book of Samuel, this is foreshadowing for what's going to happen in Samuel's own house. That's all I'm going to tell you. The things that he watches here, and that's what's so kind of powerful about the book of Samuel when you read it, is these kinds of elements of complexity and of, oh my gosh, it's happening again. It's happened. We didn't learn from our mistakes. We were doing it. And look, that's the whole message here with this warning, which is, this goes back to Egypt, Ellie. This has been since the beginning of the Exodus. We were having expectations for what's going to happen to the priests. The book of Samuel is a repetition for things that go all the way back, as we just saw today, and we're going to see a lot more of it, to stuff that goes back to Genesis. The parallels between Genesis and Samuel are astounding. This will not be the last time we'll go back and see things in the book of Genesis, in particular, that resonate in the book of Samuel, the story of David. But this is just, again, the power of the story is how this is going to go back to it. So then I'm going to finish up with these last words.
"Why then do you maliciously trample upon the sacrifices and offerings that I have commanded? You have honored your sons more than me, feeding on the first portions of every offering of my people Israel. Assuredly, declares the Lord, the God of Israel, I intended for you and your father's house to remain in my service forever. But now, declares the Lord, far be it from me, for I honor those who honor me, but those who spurn me shall be dishonored. Time is coming when I will break your power and that of your father's house, and there shall be no elder in your house. You will gaze grudgingly at all the bounty that will be bestowed on Israel, but there shall never be an elder in your house. I shall not cut off all your offspring from my altar, but to make your eyes pine and your spirit languish, all the increase in your house shall die as ordinary men. And this shall be a sign for you. The fate of your two sons, Hophni and Pinchas, they shall both die on the same day.
Wow. This is not good news for Eli. He's basically being told, your time and your legacy as a priest is over. So maybe it went to your house for a while. It ain't going to stay in your house. The priesthood is not staying in your house. And again, it's not the same thing as a kingship, but there's some similarities. There is some dynasties, right? There are dynasties, and we're going to see them in the priesthood of who gets to be a priest, and it goes all the way up, folks. Very important, till we see in the book of Maccabees and the stories in Josephus of what happened with the Hasmoneans, with the Maccabee household. Is not good. It is brutal, the dynastic struggles for the priesthood. So it went on during the Bible. It goes on all the way until the temple is destroyed. There will be fights for who gets to be a priest. And Eli is just told, your time, your reign, and your family's, your line, you're not going to be in charge anymore.
And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will act in accordance with my wishes and my purposes. I will build for him an enduring house, and he shall walk before my anointed evermore. And all the survivors of your house shall come and bow low to him for the sake of a money fee and a loaf of bread, and they shall say, please assign me to one of the priestly duties, that I may have a morsel of bread to eat.
Yeah. Now, that's where we're going to leave off today. The 2 chapters that we read introduce us to Samuel, to the house of Eli that he's working with. We'll get to the end of this part of Samuel's introduction next week. But you can see this is not good news for Eli. You'll be lucky. He basically, the man of God says, again, who is this man of God? Is this an angel? Is this a prophet? He basically says, your descendants are going to be begging for scraps in the priesthood when I'm done with you, when God's done with you. So this is a sad thing. It's not a good end to the story, at least where we are right now. It will definitely set the tone for what Samuel has to do. But in the meantime, if we don't see you tomorrow night for Genesis, we hope to see you. We were supposed to have a live service next Friday, but we're putting that on hold, as you might have seen, for January. We might be doing a live Zoom service, though, next Friday. We're going to work on trying to get that off the ground with Rick and Addie. But try to, again, stay safe, everybody. Do what you have to do to get yourself and keep safe, please, everybody. This Friday, though, I will tell you, we have a very special service that we're going to be doing for Shabbat Shirah that I produced it for JLTV, but we're going to use it for I'm going to use material for this service for this Friday for our service. This Friday is Shabbat Shirah, the Shabbat song. We have a very special service with some of the cantors in LA. So I hope that you have a chance to come on and see it. We'll leave it up there, but it's the Shabbat of song, because it's the Shabbat in the Torah that we're singing the song of Miriam and Moses, really the Shirat Hayam, the song of the sea, the song of Miriam. We're dancing and singing, and we're going to make our Shabbat filled with song. So everybody stay healthy and stay strong, everybody. Thank you for being on, and we'll see you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you, Rosemary.